first questioner. That doesn't necessarily mean that he asks the very first question, but that he listens carefully to what Shinjin is saying. And as things do not seem clear to him, or if he thinks that Shinjin should say something further, then he makes sure to bring that up in the question and answer part of the presentation. So please welcome Ungan. And those of you who are in the Atlanta area, please try to make arrangements to come and visit with Ungan. He's had both of his shots, so he cannot infect you unless he bites you. And if you want to have a cup of tea, or if you'd like to take him to lunch, you're certainly welcome to do that. He's here through the end of April.
Awesome. Okay. All right. Last month, we were talking about Buddhism as it existed in the Bactrian region, which is present-day Afghanistan, and what effect that may have had on the developments of Buddhism, especially Buddhism in China. So this month, what I wanted to do was I wanted to pick up some of those events that got that wheel rolling, so to speak, and put our focus back in India and talk about what was happening in India during this same period. And one of the things that's the most interesting, it kind of leads us back to the same person, same major player. That's Ashoka the Great. But in the 3rd century BC in India, one of the things is Buddhism was pretty fractured in terms of different schools and different teachings, and the country itself, or the subcontinent, wasn't really a country at the time, was governed by different factions of warlords. And so there wasn't anything like a coherent India, or even a coherent vision or set of teachings of Buddhism. So that's how the subcontinent was set up at the time. Keep going. You all right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So a very unsettling shaking up of the Indian subcontinent happened around 327 and 325. That totally threw the subcontinent into a lot of disorganization, a lot of disarray. Alexander the Great invaded India for the first time in 327, and he overtook the Indus Valley, and he conquered several of the warlords and made deals with several of the other ones. So it looked like things were going really well, were going his way. In 325, he was turned back in his attempt to conquer the Indus Valley. And so that was the end of his campaign. It was his last campaign. He retreated to Babylon and was actually dead within the year. So that was the end of Alexander the Great in India, but it was not the end of Greek influence on the subcontinent. One of the things that came out of this period of disarray and confusion, disorganization, was one warlord decided it was time to take over the entire subcontinent. And his name was Ashoka the Great. He was born in 304. So roughly 20 years after Alexander the Great had invaded. And he apparently was not a great guy. Apparently was somewhat immoral and sadistic. And when you read sections of his early life history, he comes off as something like a sociopath. And that's kind of an odd thing. But at the same time, he showed a real talent for both military campaigns and for administration. So he was somewhat of a natural born leader. And when he was 18, his father had enough faith in him that before he took over the throne, his father had enough faith in him that he sent him to put down a rebellion along the Silk Road. And it was during this time when he was in this outpost that he met a woman and fell in love with her. And her name was Devi. And this all comes down through the Sri Lankan traditions. But Devi was of the Shakya clan. So she was an actual relative of the Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha, and was a devout Buddhist. And you know, he marries this woman, and he doesn't convert right away, but you know, kind of gives her you know, you could almost call it lip service for her practice and her faith. And at a very decisive battle, one of the most decisive battles for him to take the entire subcontinent was called the Battle of Kalinga. It happened around 260 BC. And after the battle was over, he walked out over the battleground and saw a lot of dead and mutilated bodies, wounded people that might still be alive. And he had this huge change of heart because he had to come to grips with the amount of suffering that he had caused, even though it might have been politically necessary for him to go to war at the time. He saw each of those dead and dying people as they were connected to everyone they were related with. And he realized that they were sons and fathers and brothers, husbands, and now they were dead. And that was something he was somewhat responsible for. So he decided at that point to become Buddhist and began practicing in a very serious way. And he also opened up the national treasuries and built a lot of temples and gave a lot of money to Buddhist groups, and you know, took on the title of Ashoka the Great. He united the subcontinent, and apparently his personality and his demeanor really changed. He became a very kind and compassionate person, and really tried to live up to the Dharma, if we're to believe the history. Well, in 240. He convened a third council. Remember, we talked about the first and second councils in the last 2 months. So the third council takes place in 240. And one of the things that he wanted to do was he wanted to make a uniform approach to the Dharma. And at that time and place in India, this was predominantly Theravada. Mahayana wasn't really a very large contingent, and it apparently was not a very coherent contingent at this time. So we'll come back to that. But there are some historians that even suggest that the Mahayanan schools were actually excluded from participation in the third council. And he died, you know, at a ripe old age in his 70s, and he had sent his son to Sri Lanka as a Buddhist emissary. And somewhere after that is where we have the Lankavantura Sutra, which was the sutra that Bodhidharma took with him to China and told his early followers, everything you'll ever need to know is in here. So we've got a coherent country, and we've got an attempt to make Buddhism a coherent set of practices and set of teachings. Problem is, you know, or we could conceive of it as a problem, especially since we're Soto Zen, Mahayana was not included in that cohesion. So where did this come from? What changed there? Well, the earliest writings that anyone has been able to find that are considered Mahayana are stone inscriptions that date to about 180 BC. Okay, so this is after the reign of Ashoka, after the third council. And the earliest ideas were various interpretations of what are called the three turnings of the Dharma wheel. The first being the Four Noble Truths. The second, that all phenomenon have no independent essence and no arising. And that was what the Buddha taught the first bodhisattvas. If you read through the Heart Sutra, this is where he's talking to Shariputra. So he's not talking to the General Assembly. He's just talking to Shariputra. And one of the things that we're told from the folklore is that after the Buddha achieved enlightenment, he didn't teach for quite a while, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 6 months, that he only taught bodhisattvas because the general public was not ready for what he had to say. So he would teach the bodhisattvas would teach lay people. The third turning of the Dharma wheel was the same information as the second turning, but this is when the Buddha decided everybody could understand this, and he started teaching a general congregation. So this is kind of the first Mahayana idea as it differs from Theravada. So when we look at Mahayana, there's one guy, very interesting guy, the 14th patriarch in India, Narajuna, and there's virtually no historical information, biographical information about this guy. They think the earliest he could have been born was 150 AD, and the latest he could have been alive was about 250 AD. So somewhere in this period, he lived and worked, and they're not even sure what part of India he was from. But they do know he was Indian. They do know that he was from a Brahmin family, and he lived somewhere in this period, and he wrote a lot, kind of like Dogen. We have a lot of writings that have been passed down that are alleged to have been written by him. And one of the things that he did was he said, we've got to get back to the middle way. That's the important thing. That these Theravada schools are all over the place, and we have to go back to the middle way. And so in the Tibetan tradition, he's actually revered as the second Buddha. He has a place of very, very high reverence in the Tibetan tradition, and in the Chinese tradition, he is considered the father of Mahayana Buddhism. Even though that's probably not the case when you look at the history. That Mahayana had been around for at least 200 years before Narajuna had lived, but they considered him important enough to call him the father of Mahayana Buddhism. And one of his most important writings was called The Verses of the Middle Way, and he talks about the theory of emptiness, that nothing exists independently, and that's one of the concepts that we chant when we chant the Heart Sutra. And there were rival schools of Buddhism at the time that believed, kind of in an extreme, that all things exist independently. They arise independently, they exist independently, they pass away independently. And were schools of Buddhism at the time that believed that nothing actually exists, only our ideas of these things exist. And Narajuna was, no, it's right down the middle. Nothing exists independently. Everything is connected to everything else. And he called this concept emptiness, which I don't think is the way that we perceive of something being empty. It's interesting that the word that he used for emptiness, shunya, in Sanskrit, is also the word that the Indian mathematicians at the time used for the concept of zero. So it's kind of different. He almost looked at it as like a placeholder. And like if you took a number like 207, that zero right in the middle was sort of a place number because there was nothing in that 10 region. You had a 200, you had a 7, but you didn't have anything in that region of tens. It wasn't 237 or 247. So the zero, the emptiness, is kind of a placeholder. Kind of an oddball concept, but a lot of the Indian writings are like this. They're really, really kind of opaque and kind of difficult to plow through. But another example you could look at another way to try and look at this is, let's say, is there any such thing as something being red? Right now we're looking at John Mitchell's red shirt. Okay, so does that red exist in and of itself, or does it only exist in relationship to other colors? So kind of a philosophical conundrum there. And Narajuna said the same thing about causal relationships, and he called those the conditions. And his idea was the effect will continue as long as the condition exists. And he likened this mostly to the Four Noble Truths. Suffering arises. We're going to suffer because suffering arises. We're going to cause our suffering because we attach. And we have a way out because there is attachment, and attachment can be controlled. So all of these things exist in a causal chain with each other. It's kind of interesting because there are some historians who believe that he was heavily influenced by the Greek schools of philosophy, and especially the school of Pyrrhonism. Pyrrho was a Greek philosopher, but there's other scholars that say that influence probably more likely went in the other direction, that the Seleucid Greeks, who were the descendants of Alexander the Great's army, were influenced by the Indian philosophers more so than the other way around. And that's kind of an interesting idea, because that sort of dovetails into what we were talking about last week in the Bactrian region, where Buddhism probably did come in contact with a lot of Hellenistic thought. And there probably was a lot of cross-fertilization as Buddhism traveled back and forth on the Silk Road. So one of the quotes that I really liked from Narajuna was, all is possible when emptiness is possible. Nothing is possible when emptiness is not possible. So we can chew on that one for a little bit, and may not ever get to the actual meaning of what he was trying to say. But it's interesting that Mahayana remained a very minor movement within Buddhism for several hundred years. And in Narjuna's time, it was very minor. It didn't change until the 5th century, when Mahayana, the ideas really took root and really started to flourish. And of course, we know what happened in the 5th century. Buddhism really by then had taken root in China. And historically, we believe that happened under the jurisdiction of Bodhidharma, but it's possible that Bodhidharma didn't even exist or was a composite of several people. But something about the Indian mindset and its relationship to Buddhism prevented Mahayana from taking root. It prevented this idea from really catching on in India. But the ideas of Mahayana Buddhism were able to take root and flourish in China. And I think that may have something to do with such a rigid caste system, because one of the fundamental ideas of Mahayana Buddhism is that anyone can have the experience that the Buddha had if they're willing to do the work that the Buddha did. And that's a pretty radical departure from the Theravada view of the world. So we've got these two very important characters, Ashoka undergoing this huge conversion of the way that he saw the world and uniting the Indian subcontinent and changing its relationship to the Greek philosophers, and there being much more of an exchange of information that I think most between the Hellenistic philosophical schools and the Buddhist philosophical schools, and I think a lot of Buddhists really realize. And then Narajuna kind of being the guy that said, no, we've got to get back to this middle path, that here's what the Buddha taught, and we have to get closer to what he was saying, as opposed to the Theravada schools at the time, which were apparently all over the place. And there was also a fourth council, which it had the similar goals of the third council, which was to make a more coherent set of teachings, make Buddhism more a singular idea. And once again, this was a completely Theravadan event. It took place in about 25 BC. So the Buddha had been gone for about 400 to 500 years when this happened. And Mahayana just never took root in India. It had to actually leave. So you kind of have this other idea, even though Narajuna was revered as a great philosopher, he was not accepted in his own home country in a lot of ways. And, most spiritual traditions tell us that's what's going to happen to prophets anyway. So, anyone else have any ideas or any questions about this?
And again, folks, as always, if you have questions, please come off of mute, raise your hand, and those on Facebook, just shoot us a note in the chat. Thanks, everybody. So if no one else, yes, go ahead. Ungan, please.
My job, isn't it? To ask
It is your job, yeah.
I have read somewhere, or maybe you said it previously, about when Alexander the Great went into the Indian subcontinent there, and he took along with him philosophers and scribes to learn about other religions and philosophies. So could you speak to this? Is that part of the
Yeah,
story?
I've always heard that too, that Alexander the Great was actually a very well educated man. And I don't really know how much he soaked up and learned from being in India, but it's his life in Persia. He essentially went native. He married a local girl and started dressing like a Persian and speaking Persian. I think that if he had stayed in India, he may have done the same thing there. But I think it's one thing I think is really interesting was the amount of flow of information between the Greeks and the Indians at this time. It's something that we don't really think about.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Again, anyone else in the room, questions, comments, please raise your hand or just come off mute.
Yes, please.
Go ahead, Cosette.
Okay. So thank you for this look into historical context. So when I look at the verses from the center and the commentary by Stephen Batchelor, one of the things that Nagarjuna talks about, as a matter of fact, I think it's from the same verse that you referenced earlier, when you said, when emptiness is possible, everything is possible.
Mm-hmm.
That verse on awakening, the very first stanza says, the Dharma taught by Buddhas hinges on two truths, partial truths of the world and truths which are sublime, which is kind of a central theme of Nagarjuna. And my question is, since you've kind of looked at the cultural context and resistance to some of these Mahayana ideas, do you think that had any play in terms of that approach to it? It's kind of a middle way approach to absolute versus relative truths as well, and he's trying to tread that balance between them. And do you think that that did or did not play well in the culture of the time?
I get the impression that it did not, and I get the impression that in a lot of ways, the Buddha's ideas didn't play well in India from the very beginning. That India remained primarily Hindu and primarily Jain, and I think that you know, you have to wonder, would Buddhism have died out if it never had left the Indian subcontinent? So I think that, yeah, we probably are looking at several hundred years of these ideas not really catching on until they actually morphed into what we saw later. And but apparently one of the first places where it you know, if you, all the research I did on Ashoka, one of the places that it really seems to have caught fire very early was Sri Lanka. And I don't know that much about Sri Lanka, but apparently the emissaries that Ashoka sent, the teachings really took root there, and we see a lot of very early sutras being written in that part of the world, and we see teachers leaving Sri Lanka and heading north into other parts of the Indian subcontinent and into Bactria, or Afghanistan as it's known today. And the Bactrian schools that we talked about last month probably founded on a lot of these Sri Lankan ideas. But yeah, I think that's an interesting point. It's tough to know how much of this was taking root at the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna check, quick mic check from you.
Do what? Testing, 1, 2, testing.
Any other questions?
So Nagarjuna's followers, I think there are a couple terms, Madhyamika, Prasangika, one of those terms, I don't know which one, means make no assertions. So one of the interesting things to me about Nagarjuna that you might speak about Shinjin, they would stage public debates, and they were said, he and his followers would make no assertions, but the other pundits would come and they would assert their understanding of Atman or whatever it happens to be that they're defending at the moment, and they would simply demolish all the premises underlying that assertion. But the compelling thing to me was their intention was not to humiliate the opponent or win the debate in that sense, but to sort of relieve them of their delusion, so that the underpinnings of their confusion or delusion would be demolished, and the opponent would actually have a chance of having an insightful experience right there on the spot. If you compare it to what we call political debate today, you can see that the intention is not the same. So I think it would be interesting to hear anything more you can tell us about Nagarjuna. I can never trace this quote, but one quote that I recall from attributed to him is he said, enlightenment or insight is seeing into the flux of arising, abiding, changing, and decaying. Actually seeing into the flux, which I think brings it back to Zen.
Yeah, I would agree with that. One of the things that is interesting about him is in most of the Indian Buddhist traditions that did survive, he's more famous for being a philosopher than a great teacher of Buddhism. That's kind of how he is viewed, as this great philosophical mind, which would really sync up to someone that was holding public debates and making no assertions.
And the other point I want to make, and you don't have to crane around this way to talk to me.
Well, that's the only way I can hear.
Okay.
That's a yeah.
A contextual point I think we have to keep in mind is that in 2,500 years ago, Nagarjuna was 14, so he was halfway through the Indian transmission to Bodhidharma, who was 28.
Mm-hmm.
I think one reason that this radical idea of emptiness, which Nagarjuna was trying to clarify, would not catch on, Whereas today, I think we embrace it much more readily, is that they simply did not have the physical science that we have today. You know, if we say today, if we say form is emptiness, emptiness is form, for most people, I think that's an analogy to matter is energy, energy is matter, and energy being the larger category into which matter is subsumed. And the atomic bomb proved it in no uncertain terms. So I think today we have the advantage of modern science, physics in particular, that makes some of these radical ideas a little more acceptable. But remember, you know, 1200, 2500 years ago, everything seemed very, very real. You bang your head on the wall, it hurts. And to say that that's empty, for us to say it's more space or more energy than matter, that's pretty acceptable. But in those times, that would have been like, I don't know, some sort of, you know, hocus pocus kind of idea.
Yeah, and that was kind of one of the rabbit holes I went down when I was working on this talk, was that, you know, we translate the word emptiness from shunya, but is emptiness really what it means? And, you know, as you...
In the sense of void, they used to talk about it as being void, but Mahayana Buddhism says, no, it's not void, it's like potential energy.
Right.
You know, virtual particles, that type of thing.
Yeah, and, you know, I really kind of got I spent a lot of time thinking about this idea that it's the same word that the mathematicians were using for zero.
Right.
You know, because zero doesn't really mean nothing, you know, because there's negative numbers underneath zero.
Right.
So zero is kind of this placeholder. I like this idea that emptiness really meant a placeholder.
I think that's brilliant.
Yeah, that there was potential to be something there. There just wasn't anything there at the time you were looking at it. And, you know, I think that emptiness, it's one of those words that I think when we get deep into the translation, it may not mean what we are assuming it means. A lot like mu. You know, I don't think we can translate mu to mean nothing.
Right.
I think that a lack of resistance is probably a much closer translation. You know, when does a dog have Buddha nature? And he said mu. I don't think that he meant nothing. I think he meant, well, a dog is not resistant to reality the way that we are.
If you look at the digital revolution, the 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, you can't have the 1 without the 0, and you can't have the 0 without the 1.
Right. And, you know, that was one of Narjuna's main points, was that, you know, nothing is arising independently. Everything is completely connected, which I think became a huge Mahayana concept. I mean, that is one of the key meanings of the Heart Sutra, is that nothing is arising independently.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And Sensei, yes, I'm good.
One of the definitions I've heard for the word sunyata, or whatever it is, the Zen Study Society defines it as things are exactly as they appear, but they are only appearances and have no permanent essence. That fits into modern day philosophy pretty well.
Well, and I think it fits into modern day philosophy pretty well, and I think it fits into the Buddha's original teachings pretty well. You know,
That's what I like.
I think, you know, you could sum that up when the Buddha said everything is burning. The whole world is burning. Everything you see is not going to be here forever.
Let me ask you another history question. We're talking about why Mahayana had not stuck in India, or not even Buddhism. Actually, in your research, did you run into the idea that as the Muslims started their invasion, like in the year 700 or so, that by the year 1100, that's when the Nalanda University fell, and the Muslims came in big time and literally killed many of the Buddhist priests, and the rest of them packed up and took their sutras and went to Sri Lanka. And that's one of the factors that led into Buddhism not being as strong in India as it might have been otherwise.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. I didn't do that much research. I kind of stopped at the year 250. I kind of stopped with Narajuna's death for this, but that's definitely an interesting idea that we can look at going forward. But we kind of touched on that last month when we talked about what happened in Bactria, and it was the same exact thing. There was a Chinese historian, I've got his name in here somewhere, who went and visited the Bactrian region and went back to China, and he was totally floored. And this would have been in about 700, how rich and large the Buddhist community was. How many, he said the 10,000 monks, living in one valley. And, we talked about the building of the Belyim Buddhas that were destroyed by the Taliban, but by like 1725, it was all gone because, the expanse of Islam had totally subverted it. They dismantling the schools all the way out to outright killing of the monks. So thank you. So I think, and this is something we've touched on because we've talked about Bodhidharma many times, and we've talked about the Taoist influence on Buddhism many times. But I think somehow, some way, this idea that hung on by a shoestring or hung on by a spider web in India for several hundred years flourished and took root in China for a variety of reasons. The Chinese mindset is not the same as the Indian mindset. Taoism obviously exerted a huge influence, and that's became Mahayana Buddhism as we know it now. Because the history of what Mahayana Buddhism was from the Buddha's time to Narajuna's time in India is really pretty murky. It was tough for me to find information on it. There really wasn't a whole lot there.
And since they have a comment from David E. Doss on Facebook, he's like, I don't have a question, but I would like to express gratitude for this talk, Gasho. I love learning the history and appreciate how you are covering this.
Oh, well, tell him thank you very much. Yeah.
Chishiki.
Shinjin Sensei, thank you so much for that talk.
Thank you.
Well, I'm interested, maybe if you did any research, you raised a question about how Buddhism kind of flourished and then died out in India. And my understanding, which probably isn't absolutely accurate, is that Buddhism was kind of a Reformation movement from Hinduism, and Hinduism really wasn't a cohesive. It really wasn't a cohesive religion. In fact, I think the word Hinduism was basically a term for people that lived on the Indus River, or the other side of the Indus River, or something like that. It was more of a geographical designation than a religious designation.
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder, being a kind of, have you looked at sort of the Reformation movement that Buddhism was and kind of where it came out of Hinduism? Obviously, Shakyamuni was probably raised Hindu, or whatever particular version of Hinduism might have been in the area where the Shakya clan was, but kind of how this Reformation movement got started. It's a little bit different maybe than what you were talking about, but it's,
yeah. Well, I think how it kind of dovetails into what I was talking about was, India was not, we perceive India now as a coherent place, and, with one country with one predominant religion, one predominant view of the world. I think at that time it was nothing like that. It was patchwork warlords. It was hundreds of different cultures. It's still hundreds of different cultures. It's still hundreds of different languages, even though it was, even though now it's one single country. But I think at the time we have to assume that it was hundreds of different spiritual teachings and backgrounds. And one of the things we talked about, I remember we talked about in January, that an itinerant teacher living in the woods and taking on disciples, was not uncommon at all. There was hundreds of guys exactly like the Buddha living exactly like he did. And so why did this one guy manage to, we're still talking about him 2,500 years later. But yeah, I didn't really look into that specifically, but yeah, we can't help but think that, India at the time was a mixed match of all sorts of different ideas and different kinds of people and different kinds of spiritual paths. The one thing that we can assume to be correct is that the Buddha would have had to have spoken to his followers in ideas and in ways that they would understand. So if they believed in certain things, the Buddha would have to speak to them in those kinds of metaphors and that kind of language to be understood, even though there's probably a lot of subtle and even not so subtle differences. I mean, rebirth and reincarnation aren't the exact same thing. And, he was speaking to people who had grown up being taught reincarnation, but he taught rebirth, so a little bit different. So there's probably hundreds of things like that in the Buddha's teachings that, for one thing, make it so radical, and B, make it the thing that was able to survive all this time and all of these changes and all these different cultures, but at the same time was also probably prevented it from becoming the national religion of India. Even though you had Ashoka attempting to make it that way, it still didn't really catch on, just in pockets. Yeah.
I wonder if one of the reasons why it sort of continued to flourish in other countries was because they didn't match more closely with the religions that were in those countries. I mean, you mentioned reincarnation, and it's kind of interesting when you look out when Buddhism went up into Tibet, it kind of blended with the Bon tradition, which was a anyway, different. Yeah, but sort of blended with that in such a way that actually the Tibetans still believe in reincarnation, right? They don't believe in rebirth. So the Tibetan version of Buddhism is a little bit different. We look at kind of how it's blended in China and blended in Japan with the cultures that are right there, and perhaps maybe monotheism, which Hindu, I guess, is, even though everybody thinks it's a polytheistic religion, it's actually monotheistic. It's just everybody disagrees on what the God that's name actually is.
Right.
Who it is,
Yeah.
But maybe that was part of the reason it didn't blend. I don't know. I just think that's fascinating how Buddhism blends into other cultures and takes on pieces of other traditions or other religions, and it kind of flourishes as its own sort of flavor.
Yeah, that's true, and that brings us to here and now. What's America going to do to Buddhism? I mean, we've only have 70 years of American Buddhism, really, and what are we going to bring to it? What's that? Are we bringing to it? Yeah. So that's an interesting question.
Sensei, I have a question from Facebook from Diana Peterson. Thank you for the question, Diana. Last week or the week before, it was mentioned that Tibetan Buddhism is one of the youngest versions of Buddhism and is linked to shamanistic practices. Could you elaborate on that?
It's not really my area of expertise, but it's credited to a Tibetan saint named Milarepa as being one of the first founders of Buddhism in Tibet. From what I can gather, it did not travel over the Silk Road. It traveled up over the mountains. So, it probably those teachings didn't come in contact with the Hellenistic ways that we talked about Mahayana may have. But the Tibetan, I always, we get a lot of questions about Tibetan Buddhism, and it's not something I have studied outside of reading the biography of Milarepa. That's pretty much everything I know about it. But I've been to Nepal where it's practiced, and it is very, very different from what we do here. The common people, that live in the villages really only interact with Buddhism insofar as the monks kind of officiate at things like weddings and funerals and things like that. But to go into a Tibetan monastery, it's very, very chaotic. And, like if you look around the room here, it's very austere. We're all wearing black. Temple, and there's just garish murals everywhere, bright colors. Nobody's sitting, but everybody's chanting. I remember one time walking into a room where there was a bunch of young boys, I don't think there was anybody in there older than about 14. They were all supposed to be chanting. Well, two of the boys had this one guy flipped over upside down on a table, and there was another guy just beating the crap out of him, and the chanting was still going on anyway. So it just seems to be a really radically different approach than what we do.
Thanks so much for that question. And then another comment from Facebook from John Fitzpatrick. Many gods in esoteric Buddhism have Hindu roots and Shinto influence in Japan. Classical religions borrow from each other, especially the same regions of the world.
Yeah, good point.
Yeah, and just a note too from Diana Peterson's Tibetan Buddhism did pick up a lot of shamanistic practices in their lasangs and their smoke ceremonies. And if one of the biggest shamans initially was Padmasambhava, who was called to clear out the demons from their temples. So, I mean, there's a lot of shamanistic principles and practices, just like within Christianity, there's a lot of paganistic practices. Right. So you're right. Just like with John's comment, it picks up things regionally as it moves along. Yeah,
so. Picks up cultural ideas as it goes. Yeah.
And again, everyone, thank you for your comments and questions online. If you have any other questions or comments, just please continue to put them online. So again, online, is there any other questions from Zoom? If you do questions, comments, just please come off of mute. Corolla, I see your hand up. And then also Randy.
The areas around Tibet had an indigenous religion called Bon. And when Buddhism moved into this area, and not always peacefully, they absorbed a lot of the practices. And as we speak, archaeologists are exploring caves in Tibet and Nepal that were the storehouses of rescued documents that the Bon priests took with them. And there's now sort of an effort to reconcile the Tibetans and the Bon, the few remaining Bon practitioners. So this is just like the collision of Buddhism and Hinduism, and the collision between Buddhism and Taoism, where Buddhism has a great deal of flexibility built in. Buddha himself said, this will change. And it will change to meet the needs of the people. And this is just another example of how Buddhism has moved around and settled into places and mixed with what was already there.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the talks I think we did in February was we talked about the effect of Taoism on Buddhism and vice versa. Yeah, but I think that's a kind of a profound truth of all this.
Kosetsu, do you have a comment? I'm sorry.
Yes. So I think one aspect of that is that Buddhism is not, I don't know if this is the right terminology, a dogmatic religion in terms of you absolutely must believe this, and then by exclusion, you may not believe other things. Look at Christianity, for example, where you have an affirmation of faith. This is the list of things we must believe. Whereas in Buddhism, it's much more open to coexistence with other traditions, which is why I think attributes to we can attribute to some of the great differences to different geographic regions where it did coexist with and absorb some of the previously existing traditions like Taoism or Bon.
Yeah, and it almost begs the question, if we look at it that way, it begs the question again, is Buddhism even a religion? Or is it a code of ethics? And,
Right.
A code of ethics and a practice. And if you participate in the practice and you adhere to the code of ethics, you're still allowed to believe whatever you want to believe.
Right. Mhm. That's a whole nother talk.
And let me know when you feel like ramping up and giving it.
Don't worry, Cosette's is actually on point next month. So
That's awesome.
We'll be hearing from him.
But I already started developing a different topic for that one.
Okay, well, good. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, we'll put that on the list for next time, Cosette's.
Yeah,
Add it to my backlog.
there you go.
And Sensei, one other question from John Fitzpatrick on Facebook. Sorry, I did not ask a question, but how does present day Soto Zen address God's and esoteric side of Buddhism?
We don't. I for one could care less. What does anybody else think? Yeah.
Hojo Sensei.
If anything is God, everything is God. And if the God is the designer of the world, it's a pretty bad designer. But at least he or she has a great sense of humor.
That's true.
I think Buddha's response was the question does not fit the case.
Category error.
Yeah. It's interesting because I think that's more of a question dealing with mysticism. And Buddhism isn't mystical. I'm sure there's mystical trappings in some places and in some schools, but in the big picture, Buddhism isn't mysticism. We were invited to take part in a series on mysticism that's going to happen next year. And we had to say, well, we really can't help you because what we do isn't mystical. So, yeah, I think that one of my favorite quotes from the Buddha, he was invited to debate one of the Hindu theologians at the time, and they were thrown the typical questions like that, does God exist? What is the nature of God? Where did he come from? All these kinds of questions. And the Buddha's answer was, if I were to tell you that, how would it help? You're still here, you're still in your life, and you're still required to carry on with a certain amount of ethics. And regardless of what you believe God is or could be, the Four Noble Truths are still the Four Noble Truths. That's why they're called noble. They don't interact with anything, kind of like a noble gas, like helium. These things are still true regardless of your mystical stance.
I have a quick, go ahead. I have a quick question. There was I think it was Cosette's. He mentioned that Buddhism, does well, with other kind of thoughts and beliefs. But there is, from a Buddhist perspective, like the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Paths. How does that differ from things that are truly accepted versus the dogmatism? And that could be Cosette's too for you or for Sensei, either one of the Senseis.
Yeah, I think
But there are some generally accepted things that, Buddhists across the board, with whatever sect they're from, kind of agree on, like suffering, like
right.
emptiness, so how does that differ from dogmatism? Or
I think that how it differs is with dogmatism, you're required to believe that an event actually happened, not a philosophical truth or a philosophical standard. But if you were in a dogmatic situation, you actually have to believe that a guy built a big boat, put two of every animal on the planet in it, and rode out a massive flood. That's an absurd story. It's a metaphor, but there's no way that historically took place or anything like it. So I would say in a non-dogmatic situation where the idea is a code of ethics and is a practice, you're not required to believe a story like that. And dogmatism, you'd actually be required, you have to accept that as truth. And, you know, one of the things I think that's where it's got the biggest breakdown is when you talk about the languages that all these stories and all these writings were originally written in are nothing like the languages we speak today. And like we've got a lot of brain power in this room and on this Zoom, and we don't have an agreement on what the word emptiness really means. And we don't have an agreement on emptiness as Narajuna was using it. Well, the same thing's true of the Old Testament. If you can read the original Hebrew, the creation story does not read at all like the James translation. But if you're in a very dogmatic situation, you would be required to believe that that is the word of God. That story is true. But even if you go back to their original language, it's radically different.
I'm sorry, Chishiki and Shikak question. You sure? Good. Yep. Corolla.
We do not have a mechanism that says you're in and you're out. And we sort of just have certain confidence that if you sit with us long enough and hang out with us long enough, you will come to see the logic and the truth of the Four Noble Truths. And I think that's different from having an orthodoxy and a dogma. We just say, okay, here it is, you can take it or leave it. And even if you leave it, you can play with us, which I think is quite different from many other practices.
I think that's a really beautiful way to put it. Thank you for that. And I think on that note, that's a very good place to end. Thanks for everybody's attention. Thanks for being here. Thanks for your questions. And we'll pick this up again. We'll pick this up again in a month and talk about what happened for the next 300 years in India.
Gotcha. Thank you for your teaching,
Thank
Sensei.
you.
And I'm glad you did the jumping off point on that because next, speaking of what's coming up in May, we have during the next period of time that we usually have you, we're actually going to be having
Have our retreat. Yeah.
the retreat. And then we're also going to have the panel of which Shinjin is one of those folks. So yes, he can still comment and have questions on that. So.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll push back more history and legacy until June.
Awesome. All right. So again, just before we close out, as always, we just want to again thanks everyone for their continued practice and their continued support. For without you, we would not be able to sustain our practices as our teachers, et cetera. So if you're already a consistent giver, we are so grateful for your support. But if you're not one, we'd ask that you consider contributing, value given, value received. So Gasho for that. And upcoming events, again, I mentioned the conference, our retreat. We sent a note out and we several communications. It's May 13th to the 16th, Vows in Bloom. And again, we're again talking about precepts and getting some in-depth practice and some teaching and conversations together with the Sangha and our practice leaders. Also coming up, we have again Angan here for the rest of April. Please take advantage of him and Ango. He is here. He is leading our beginners on Wednesdays and available for in-depth interactions. So please take advantage of that opportunity. That's a treat for us. Again, Sensei's book is out. If you haven't got a copy, please get a copy. He'll also be interviewed during the conference, the retreat. I keep saying conference because I have that on my mind from September. But Hojo Sensei. Yeah, I think we're good.
On the podcast, Householders podcast, I was interviewed about the book. So if anybody wants to listen to that, go to the podcast page, ASZC, the Householders. And next week, I will be speaking on contemporary teaching from the book. And what I would like to do this time is invite those of you who are online, anybody else who's interested, to send a question about the book, assuming you've read it. And then Ungan, Bill Mayhew here will fill in with other questions. He's read the book 3 times now. He's had a lot of comments and questions about it. So rather than read from the book so much, I think I would like to answer any questions anyone has next week, if that's suitable.
Thank you, Hojo Sensei. And as always, Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, there's plenty of opportunities to practice during the week. Check out our schedule, ASZC.org. And if no further comments or questions, we'll end with our closing Dharma verses.
Beings are numberless, I vow to be. Illusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to create them. Illusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it. Beings are numberless, I vow to create them. Illusions are inexhaustible, I vow to end them. Dharma gates are boundless, I vow to enter them. The way is unsurpassable, I vow to realize it.
Again, as always, thanks everyone for your practice, your support. Continue to be safe and be well throughout the week. And Gasho. And John, thank you for putting the podcast link in there.